The citadel of the Vrethkai was not built for humans. Nothing about it accommodated a species that stood upright on two soft legs, breathed a single atmosphere, and required 8 hours of unconsciousness per cycle just to function. The ceilings in the lower corridors ran 40 feet high, arched like the ribcage of something enormous, because they had been designed around the wingspan of something enormous. The floors were slick volcanic stone, still faintly warm from whatever furnace event had birthed the mountain beneath them 3,000 years ago. The light came from bioluminescent lichen that pulsed in slow arterial rhythms, never bright enough for human eyes, never quite dark enough for rest. The smell was sulfur and iron and something older than both, a musk that worked its way into your clothes and your hair and eventually your sleep, so that you dreamed in shades of amber and charcoal. Tamaz Reyes had worked there for 11 months. He was going on 12. He pushed his mop cart down the corridor that the Vrethkai staff called the Long Throat, a 200-meter passage connecting the hatching galleries to the ceremonial hall, and he did not hurry. There was no point hurrying in the Long Throat. It took as long as it took, and the stone always looked the same at the end as it had at the beginning, dark and damp and faintly judgmental. He moved at his own pace, which was the pace of a man who had learned that the work was its own thing, separate from clocks. You didn't race a mop across 40 feet of volcanic stone. You let the mop go where it wanted and you followed. He was 34 years old. He had a degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Guadalajara that had never once been relevant to anything he'd done since earning it. He had a scar on his left forearm from a belt sander. He had a battered paperback copy of a Steinbeck novel, the one about the brothers in the valley, in the front pouch of his custodial cart, the spine so broken and rebroken that the pages fanned out at rest like a half-opened flower. He had a government tissue universal comm bead behind his left ear and a government tissue uniform that was 3 sizes too large, because the procurement office hadn't thought very hard about what a human-scaled employee would actually need. He had, tucked into the breast pocket of that uniform, a photograph of his sister's kids taken at the beach outside Mazatlan. That was the complete inventory of Tamaz Reyes in the citadel of the Vrethkai. He had reviewed it many times during slow mop cycles. It still seemed like enough. The Vrethkai themselves were rarely in the Long Throat at this hour. They kept different rhythms active in the deep heat cycles, withdrawn in the cold ones, and this stretch of pre-dawn silence was, for all practical purposes, his. He found he liked it that way. He was not unfriendly toward the Vrethkai. He had simply concluded, after 11 months, that they found him functionally invisible, and that invisibility in an alien royal court was not the worst condition a man could occupy. The court functionaries swept past him with their great scaled flanks and their clicking secondary joints, and their head frills fanned wide against the ambient temperature, and they registered him the way you register furniture, as an obstacle to navigate, present but categorically irrelevant. The head keeper had told him this essentially on his first day. Not unkindly. She had fixed him with one enormous amber eye the size of a dinner plate and said, through the translator bead, "You will be invisible here, mammal. This is a mercy." The court does not trouble what it does not see. Her name was Vareth Sky, and she was 900 years old, and she had managed the Citadel's staff and maintenance protocols since before the human Vrethkai Accords had been formalized. She was, Tamaz had concluded, deeply tired of all of it. She moved through the corridors with the particular gravity of something that had watched too many things change and expected to watch many more, and her warnings to Tamaz, delivered in those first weeks with the regularity of a broadcast, had carried less threat than exhaustion. Don't enter the hatching galleries unbidden. Don't approach the royal clutch without a keeper escort. Don't speak unless addressed by a senior Vrethkai. Don't, above all, draw attention. He had followed the rules. He was a professional. He had not, however, expected the hatchlings. The first time, he had been cleaning the secondary access corridor that ran along the east wall of the hatching galleries, not inside, just the corridor, and he had heard the sound. It was not a sound he had a word for, not at first. A dry, rapid percussion, like someone riffle-shuffling a deck of cards made of silk. Then a pressure change. Then a small, solid weight arrived without warning in the center of his back and latched on. He had not screamed. He was proud of this. He had turned, very slowly, and found himself looking at a creature approximately the size of a large domestic cat. If that cat had wings folded against its body like a collapsed umbrella, and scales the color of old copper coins, and eyes that were entirely gold with no pupils that he could discern, and an expression that he would have called, if pressed, inquisitive. The hatchling had looked at him. He had looked at the hatchling. The hatchling had made a sound like a very small kettle, a sustained, trembling note that he felt in his molars, and then pressed its entire flat skull against his sternum and gone still. Tamaz had stood there for approximately 90 seconds, not moving, acutely aware that he was in a secondary corridor of a royal alien citadel being used as a perch by a dragon the size of a house cat, and had thought, with a clarity that surprised him, well, this is new. He had eventually placed his hand on the hatchling's back. The scales were warm, much warmer than the ambient temperature of the corridor, and they shifted under his palm like a mosaic of smooth stones. The hatchling's wings twitched once, resettled, and it made the kettle sound again, slower this time, more settled. He had stood there with his hand on the dragon and finished the count in his head that he always used when he needed to not panic, the count he'd developed at age 9 when the belt sander incident happened and his father had told him to breathe in for 7 and out for 11. He reached 11. He started again. By the third cycle, the hatchling was asleep. He hadn't moved for another 20 minutes. When he finally, carefully, settled the hatchling into the crook of his arm and walked it back to the hatching gallery entrance and passed it to the startled keeper on duty, the keeper had stared at him with an expression he couldn't read, 4 eyes, no visible brows, head frill flattened in what he'd learned by then usually meant distress, and said nothing at all. He had returned to his mop. He had assumed it was a one-time thing. Animals were unpredictable. Royal alien hatchling dragons were presumably even more so. It happened again 4 days later. This time it was 2 of them, and they had apparently exited the gallery through the ventilation channel that ran above the secondary corridor, which no one had considered a viable egress route, because it was barely wide enough to admit a Vrethkai juvenile and also ran through the furnace room, where temperatures were, as Tamaz understood it, dangerously high even for fire-adapted species. The hatchlings had come through the furnace room without apparent difficulty. They smelled of char and iron when they landed on him, one on his left shoulder, one attempting to establish a grip on his head before settling for his right forearm, and they were vibrating with a frequency he felt in his teeth. The coal-black one on his forearm bit him, not hard, the way a puppy does when it doesn't know yet what its teeth mean to other things. Tamaz had simply held the arm still and waited, and after a moment the hatchling had released him and instead pressed its jaw along his pulse point, which was apparently what it had been trying to get to in the first place. It stayed there, and the vibrating slowed, and the copper-colored one on his shoulder tucked its head under his chin and went quiet. He had stood in the long throat with 2 dragon hatchlings arranged on him like ornaments, and thought about what his engineering degree had not prepared him for, and the list was long. The keeper on duty that night, a different one, younger, with pale gray scales and a nervous habit of clicking his secondary joints, had arrived at something close to a run when the alert chimed. He had stopped 15 feet away from Tamaz. He had stared. He had made a sound that the translator bead had rendered as "this is not possible," and then gone silent for a very long time. "They seem fine," Tamaz had offered. The keeper had looked at him with all 4 eyes. "They come to you," the keeper had said. It was not a question. Apparently, the keeper had contacted Vareth Sky. Vareth Sky had arrived 23 minutes later, which Tamaz gathered was extremely fast for a 900-year-old Citadel administrator. She had looked at him with her single, enormous amber eye. She had lost the other one long before his species had been communicating in full sentences, and she had stood very still for a long time. "How many times?" she said. "This is the second," he said. "First time was one hatchling 4 days ago. I brought it back to the gallery entrance." "You did not report it." "I didn't think it was relevant." The head frill had moved in a way that his translator bead did not attempt to interpret. "Give them here," she said. He had transferred both hatchlings gently, taking time to do it properly, not wanting to startle them or let them drop into the keeper's arms. The coal-black one had voiced a long, resonant complaint as he did so. The copper one had gripped his sleeve briefly before releasing. Vareth Sky had watched all of it. "You will come to my office," she said, "when your shift ends." Her office was in the administrative block on the Citadel's north face, carved directly into the mountain, insulated enough that the temperature was bearable for a mammal if the mammal kept their jacket on, and also their dignity. The walls were dense with records, physical ones, he was surprised to find, pressed onto treated stone tablets in neat cursive script that the translator couldn't parse. A single lamp of bioluminescent organisms in a sealed tank on her desk provided most of the light. She did not offer him a seat because there were no chairs built for his proportions in the room. He stood. "I'm going to tell you something that you must understand completely," she said, and the translator bead gave her voice a flat, careful precision that he suspected masked a tone he wasn't equipped to read. "The Royal Clutch has not accepted a handler in 40 years. The last handler died in service. Before her, handlers were a tradition of this citadel stretching back 3,000 years. A handler is chosen by the hatchlings, not appointed. You understand what I am telling you?" He did, he said so. "What I do not understand," she said, "is why you." He hadn't had an answer for that. He still didn't, really, 11 months in. He had thought about it during slow mop cycles, during the breathing counts, during the long nights in the boiler room where he slept, because the lower corridors maintained a temperature he could live in without supplemental heating, while the upper guest quarters were built for species that ran 40 degrees warmer than he did. He had thought about it and come to no particular conclusion except the one that felt too simple to be right, which was, he was warm and he was quiet, and he did not ask anything of them. He was not afraid of them. That might have mattered. The thing about fear, he had thought this through carefully in the small hours with the boiler humming its steady note behind him, was that it was a smell to the right kind of animal, not a metaphor, an actual chemical signal. He'd known this since he was 12, and someone had explained to him why the belt sander had seemed to know his hand was coming, why tools sensed hesitation. Fear was a real thing in the air. Animals with the right biology could taste it. The Vrethkai keepers were afraid of the royal clutch in the way that people responsible for irreplaceable things are afraid. A high, constant vigilance, a readiness for crisis, a body held always slightly braced for catastrophe. It was reasonable. It was probably necessary. It also produced an ambient chemical atmosphere in the hatching galleries that the hatchlings breathed every day of their young lives. Tamaz was not responsible for the royal clutch. He was responsible for the floors. The distinction freed him in a way he hadn't fully appreciated until the first hatchling had landed on his back in the corridor. The word spread through the citadel slowly, the way all things spread through ancient institutions, through channels of formal communication that made everything sound less strange than it was, through informal channels that made everything sound stranger. By the end of his 3rd month as an unofficial secondary handler, half the court staff acknowledged him with a tilt of the head frill as he passed. The other half watched him from architectural distance, with an expression the translator bead consistently rendered as categorically problematic. He kept mopping, he kept the floors clean. Vareth Sky had modified his duties. He was still responsible for the long throat and the secondary corridors, still responsible for the furnace room and the east maintenance passage, still responsible for the service tunnels that ran beneath the ceremonial hall. But twice per shift cycle, he was now also authorized to enter the hatching galleries at designated times, not to work, just to be there, sitting in the far corner on the low stone platform that had apparently been a handler's rest station, the last time the Citadel had employed one. He brought his book, he read. The hatchlings did what they wanted. What they wanted, it turned out, was to locate him and attach themselves to him in various configurations and fall asleep. They had no apparent consistency about this. Sometimes they wanted his lap. Sometimes the coal-black one wanted his shoulder, while the copper one wanted to drape itself over his feet. A third one, russet-colored, with a jagged pale marking along its left wing that the senior keepers called a storm sign and spoke of with lowered frills, had a habit of pressing its entire body flat against his back as he sat reading, like a heated blanket that occasionally adjusted its grip. A fourth, the smallest, blue-gray as deep water, seemed to prefer the inside of his jacket when it could manage the maneuver, which it executed with the focused determination of a creature that had decided this was simply where it lived now. He had 4 names for them, not the formal Vrethkai designations, which were 3-syllable sound and vibration combinations he couldn't fully reproduce, but working names that he used only internally and that he suspected the hatchlings had no awareness of. He called them coal, copper, storm, and blue. He did not tell anyone this. Some things were private. The court's opinion of his situation was divided and vocal, which was notable because the Vrethkai as a culture were not known for being vocal about things. The accords that had allowed a human maintenance technician into the Citadel at all had been the result of a trade arrangement negotiated by people with much more relevant credentials than Tamaz possessed, xenodiplomats and resource brokers, who had exchanged technical knowledge for rare mineral access, and worked out, in careful treaty language, that human maintenance staff would remain entirely separate from matters of court life, culture, and tradition. The hatchlings had not been consulted on the treaty. Master Tevar, the Lord of Ceremonies, was particularly unsubtle about his position. He was the kind of bureaucrat who existed in every large institution, the figure whose authority derived entirely from process, who therefore treated any deviation from process as a personal assault. He was also, Tamaz had gathered, somewhere in the region of 500 years old, which meant he had spent 500 years refining his disapproval into something very pure and portable. He deployed it in corridors, in passing, in the tilt of his massive head and the specific angle of his frill. The mammal disrupts the established nursery protocols, he had said once to Vareth Sky in Tamaz's presence, and apparently not caring that Tamaz had a translator bead. It should be returned to the diplomatic pool, another posting, somewhere appropriate. The hatchlings follow it, Vareth Sky had said. They are young. They will follow novelty. They have followed it for 4 months, Tevar. Then we should reduce the opportunities for such following. The Lord of Ceremonies had looked at Tamaz with 4 eyes and a frill fanned wide and cold. The royal clutch does not bond with service staff. It never has. It has been doing so for 4 months, Vareth Sky had said. Your description of what never happens appears to be performing below expectations. Tevar had left the corridor at what Tamaz interpreted as a controlled but rapid pace. Vareth Sky had watched him go. She had then looked at Tamaz for a long moment. He is not wrong that this is unprecedented, she said. I know, Tamaz said. He will bring it before the council. I figured. She had regarded him with her one amber eye, and he had the sense, not for the first time, that she was calculating something complicated that she hadn't finished yet. You are not frightened, she said. I am a little frightened, he said. I just don't think it's useful. The amber eye had stayed on him for another few seconds. Then she had gone, and he had returned to the long throat and his mop. He thought about the warning she hadn't given him, the way you think about a door someone pointed to and then didn't open. She had told him what the bond meant, told him it was binding, told him the hatchlings had made a choice. She had not told him to leave. She had not told him the court would make it easier if he stayed. He was a careful man, and he thought about the space between those two things on the long walk back, with the mop wheels clicking against the stone in their particular uneven rhythm that he had never successfully fixed. The months that followed had their own texture, different from the months before. Before he had been invisible. After he was something else, not visible exactly, not acknowledged in any formal way, but registered. The court staff moved around him with a new quality of awareness, the way people move around something they have decided not to talk about publicly while thinking about it constantly in private. The head frill acknowledgments increased. The architectural distance observation also increased, which he supposed balanced out. He adapted his routes. Not to avoid the observers, he wasn't afraid of being watched, didn't have the energy for it, but because his twice-shift gallery access changed the rhythm of his working day, and the optimal mop circuit needed to account for the new schedule. He was an engineer. He thought about optimizing systems. The long throat got done in the first half of the shift. The east corridors got done in the second. The gallery time fell at the natural breakpoint, which happened to also be the break between the two keeper rotations, which happened to also be the quietest hour in the gallery's daily cycle, which was a coincidence that he suspected Vareth Sky had arranged and would never confirm. He learned things during those months that he had not expected to learn. He learned that hatchlings were not, as he had vaguely assumed, uniform, that each of the four had its own particular signature in sound and movement that he had begun to recognize the way you recognize voices. Cole's wing beats were the deepest of the four, a lower register even in the rapid attack glide that was his preferred mode of arrival. Copper had a sound she made when she was content that was distinct from the general kettle hum. A layered tone, two notes held simultaneously, that he eventually understood was something like purring if purring were produced by a set of resonance chambers that a mammal didn't have. Storm used silence as communication more than sound. Her stillness told you more than her noise, and he had learned to read the quality of her stillness, the difference between the stillness of attention and the stillness of unease. Blue was the smallest and the most deliberate, moved with an economy of motion that he eventually recognized as not timidity but patience, a fundamental willingness to wait for the right moment that reminded him, uncomfortably, of himself. He learned that the gallery's heat was not uniform. It rose from the volcanic floor in a gradient, cooler near the high vaulted ceiling, warmest at the nesting level. The hatchlings lived in that warm stratum the way fish live in a thermal layer. When they came into the colder corridors, they were doing something the keepers found deeply alarming, which was voluntarily leaving the temperature they needed. The keepers interpreted this as flight response aberration. Tamaz had a different interpretation, which was that the hatchlings were not fleeing something but seeking something, and that the something they were seeking was him, and that they had calculated, in whatever way very young dragons calculated things, that what he provided was worth the temperature differential. He filed this under human warmth, average mammalian body temperature at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. He ran the math once idly with the back of a maintenance requisition form. He ran roughly 30 degrees warmer than the ambient temperature of the long throat in winter, even warmer relative to the cold corridors during the low heat cycles. He was, by any thermal analysis, a notable heat anomaly in the Citadel's lower levels. He had made a note to himself to see if he could get a better insulated boiler room. The cot situation was genuinely unreasonable. He also learned, more slowly, the politics of the court as they pertained to his situation, and they were more complicated than the simple calculus of Tevar's disapproval had suggested. The Vrethkai had a concept. Varethskai explained it to him in pieces over several weeks, in the corridor conversations that had become a feature of his schedule, that translated roughly as earned standing, but was better understood as what a thing has demonstrated about itself, separate from what category it was assigned at birth. It was an old concept, predating the current royal dynasty, predating even some of the stone treaties that lined the office walls. The Vrethkai had not always been a court culture. They had been, for long stretches of their recorded history, a species that made decisions based on demonstrated capability rather than formal rank. The current court had not abandoned this concept exactly. They had formalized it, wrapped it in protocol, made it a thing that happened within channels. But the concept was still there, in the grammar of how they spoke about one another, in the particular way they responded to demonstrated competence versus assumed authority. What the Hatchlings had done coming to him, bonding with him, was, in that old framework, a demonstration, not of him, of what was between them. The Hatchlings were themselves the royal clutch, the future of the Vrethkai succession. When they made a choice, it was not a random act. In the old grammar, it was a declaration. Tevar understood this. Varethskai had been right about that. He understood it and had chosen the procedural solution, because the procedural solution let him manage the declaration without acknowledging it, which was the kind of thing that only worked if the declaration itself could be made to go away. It could not be made to go away. Tamaz knew this. Varethskai knew it. Tevar, somewhere under the 5 centuries of formal procedure, probably knew it too. The court staff who acknowledged him in the corridors knew it. The young gray-scaled keeper who became so interested in his instruments during gallery access knew it. Even the cook in the lower staff kitchen, a Vrethkai with smoky amber scales, and no rank to speak of, and no reason to involve herself in court politics, had started leaving a small container of something warm on the service shelf outside his boiler room 3 times per shift cycle, a thing she had never explained, and which he had never asked about, and which he ate because he was a practical man, and it kept the cold out. The Citadel was a living thing. It had politics and protocol, and 900 years of tradition, enforced by people who remembered the tradition from before it was tradition. But it also had its own opinion, expressed in small gestures, in the behavior of the people who kept it running, in the warmth left on a shelf and the eyes that looked away at the right moment, and the corridors that were, somehow, always just slightly warmer in the sections near his route. He was not invisible anymore. He was something the Citadel was thinking about. He held this thought in the way you hold something that is both good and precarious, careful, not gripping too hard, aware that it could shift. There was also the matter of the book. Cole had started something about 6 months in that he only understood retroactively, which was that Cole had begun responding to his reading with specific sounds. Not random sounds, responses. When he read a passage where the human protagonist did something that Cole apparently approved of, a moment of stubbornness, a refusal, a choice made against the easier option, Cole made a sound that was low and sustained and had a texture like approval. When the passage went toward grief or loss, Cole was still and radiated a quality of attention that was different from the attention of content sleep. He had sat with this for several days before he admitted to himself what it meant, which was, Cole was following the story, not linguistically, not through the words, through the emotional content of his voice, through the physical responses he had when he read, the slight shift in cadence when something moved him, the way his diaphragm changed when he was reading toward something sad versus something fierce. Cole was reading him reading the book, and through him, the book. He had started reading more expressively after that, not performing exactly, more like not suppressing what he was actually feeling about the text. It turned out he had feelings about the text that he had been doing a professional job of not broadcasting for most of his adult life, and allowing Cole to receive them felt strangely like a reasonable trade. He gave Cole the story. Cole gave him the company. Neither of them mentioned it. The other three picked up the habit in their own ways. Copper responded to the rhythm more than the content. She would shift and resettle with the beat of the sentences, and longer complex sentences sent her into a deeper stillness, and short declarative ones seemed to brighten something in her posture. Storm listened from above, from her circling orbit, and occasionally descended to press her jaw briefly against his skull in a gesture he had come to understand as, that one, that moment. Whatever that was, I felt it too. Blue heard everything from inside the jacket and expressed no obvious reactions whatsoever, but had, once, when he read the most difficult passage in the book, the one about the end of the dream, the thing that was lost, pressed both small forepaws flat against his chest from the inside of the jacket as if counting his heartbeat, as if checking that the thing it was feeling was the same thing he was. He had stopped reading for a moment at that. He had counted to 7. He had counted to 11. He had read on. The council convened in the deep cold cycle, 3 days before Tamaz's 1-year mark. He was not invited to the council session, which was correct. It was a Vrethkai internal matter, conducted in formal register that the translator Bede would have struggled with anyway. He knew it was happening because the Citadel had a particular quality of tension on council days, a drawn-in feeling like a breath held, the staff moving with extra precision, the ambient hum of the building at a slightly higher frequency. He mopped the long throat and waited. Storm found him at the midpoint of the passage, which was unusual. The hatchlings rarely came into the long throat this far from the gallery entrance, and they definitely weren't supposed to traverse it during the cold cycle, which was when the ventilation channels ran at full blast and the thermal differentials made navigation difficult for young flyers. He heard the card shuffle of wing beats before he saw her, and then she descended out of the vaulted dark above him and landed on the handle of his mop cart and regarded him with her gold eyes. "What are you doing out here?" he said. She made a sound he didn't have a word for, not the kettle hum of contentment, not the sharp complaint note of displeasure, something in between with a texture to it. "Yeah," he said, "I know." He had learned that talking to them was not strange. Maybe it was strange by some standard he no longer had access to, but in the Citadel at the long before dawn hour with his mop cart and his Steinbeck and nobody watching, it was simply what happened. He talked, and they listened with the specific quality of attention that animals have when they are not processing your words but are processing everything underneath your words. The cadence, the frequency, the rise and fall of affect. He had thought during one of the slow cycles about what it meant that they came to him. He had thought about what the other handlers, the ones Varethsky had mentioned, had been. Keepers, she'd said. People who understood the Vrethkai traditions and biology and the specific demands of hatchling care. Trained specialists, people with knowledge. He was a janitor with an engineering degree and a broken paperback. He didn't know anything about Vrethkai hatchling development. He didn't know the proper bonding protocols or the traditional handling ceremonies or what sounds to make when they were agitated. He knew how to mop. He knew how to sit quietly in the corner and read. He knew how to be warm. He thought maybe that was the thing in the end, not that he was special, not that he had some rare gift, but that he was on a foundational level available, not scheduled around them, not managing them, not performing care the way you perform a duty, just present, warm, quiet, undemanding. The boiler room where he slept was the warmest room in the lower corridors. He ran warmer than the ambient temperature of every passage in the Citadel. He was in the landscape of the Vrethkai Palace, a small point of constant heat. Animals knew where the warmth was. That was basic biology. Storm stepped from the mop handle to his forearm, walked up his arm with the careful precision she always used, and settled on his shoulder. Her wing pressed briefly against his cheek, warm as an iron. "Okay," he said, "walk with me then." He finished the long throat with Storm on his shoulder, and she was still there when Varethsky found him at the passage's end. The old keeper looked at Storm, looked at Tamaz, said nothing for a moment. "The council has decided," she said. He waited. Master Tevar's position was supported by the majority. The protocols require the royal clutch to be managed exclusively by trained Vrethkai staff. The accords specify that human service employees remain separate from court traditions. She paused. "They have authorized a reassignment, different post. You would leave the citadel within the week." Storm adjusted her grip on his shoulder. He put one hand up, slow and deliberate, and she pressed her jaw against his fingers. "And you," he said, "what do you think?" Varethsky was quiet for a long time. She was looking at the hatchling on his shoulder with an expression he had learned to read, finally, over 11 months. Not the flat administrative distance, but something older underneath it. A 900-year weariness that occasionally cracked to show what it was covering, which was that she had cared about this place for 900 years, and was therefore capable of a grief about it that was also 900 years deep. "I think," she said, "that you are the first being in 40 years who the royal clutch has come to voluntarily. I think Tevar is correct that this is unprecedented and disruptive. I also think that he is applying a procedural solution to a biological reality, which is what bureaucrats do, and which does not make the biological reality change." "What does the biological reality require?" he said. She looked at Storm. "The royal clutch bonds for life," she said. "Once the bond is formed, it does not dissolve. Not with time, not with absence, not with reassignment. What you do not understand, Tamaz Rays, is that the hatchlings are not simply following you because you are warm and quiet. They have made a choice that, in Vrethkai tradition, is as binding as any treaty." He stood with that for a moment. "Does Tevar know that?" he said. "Tevar knows it. He has chosen to manage the implications rather than acknowledge them. He believes that with time and proper intervention, the bond can be redirected. He is wrong, but he is 500 years old and has not been wrong about a procedural matter in a very long time, which makes him resistant to the experience of being wrong about this one." Storm made the in-between sound again, the one with the texture to it. "What do I do?" Tamaz said. "You cannot do anything," Varethsky said. "The council has decided. The reassignment is authorized. If you stay, you violate the accords, and the diplomatic consequences of that extend far beyond this citadel." She looked at him with her single amber eye. "But you are permitted before you go to say a formal farewell. In the hatching galleries, according to the old handler protocols which still exist in the records, which I happen to have pulled from storage this morning." He understood what she was telling him. "How long do the old protocols allow for a farewell?" he said. "They do not specify," she said. "They were written in a time when such things were understood by context." He nodded. "Then I'll take the time I need." He went to the hatching galleries alone, at the hour when the keeper staff rotated, and the gallery was technically between coverage, not unguarded, but occupied only by the duty keeper in the far observation post, a young gray-scaled one who had, over the preceding months, developed a habit of becoming very interested in the instrument array whenever Tamaz arrived. The gallery was hot. It was always hot. A banked volcanic heat that rose through the stone floors in slow pulses, kept at the specific temperature that the eggs and hatchlings required, a heat that would have been uncomfortable for extended periods if Tamaz hadn't spent 11 months acclimatizing himself to the lower corridor temperatures and working gradually toward the gallery threshold, until he could sit in the far corner without his body temperature doing anything alarming. Cole was already there. He sometimes thought Cole was always there, the most alert of them, the one most tuned to his arrival, always the first to appear and the last to release. The black scales caught the gallery's amber light and held it, gave it back as a deep, burnished glow. Cole was the size of a large dog by now, big enough that the landing on his chest, which was still Cole's preferred approach, from above, unexpected, had a real impact. He sat down on the handler's stone. Cole landed 2 seconds later and settled with the familiarity of long practice. Copper came from the left channel. Storm dropped from the ceiling with her wings fully extended, filling the upper gallery with the slow percussion that had never stopped making his pulse jump a little, and landed with the dramatic precision of an animal that knew what it looked like. Blue materialized from inside his jacket pocket, which he had not realized was possible until it happened the third time, and he had since stopped questioning it. He sat with all 4 of them arranged on and around him, and he read his book aloud. He had been doing this for months, not because he thought they understood Steinbeck, but because the sound mattered, the rhythm of it, the rise and fall of the sentences. He read the part about the brothers and the valley and the long argument between tenderness and hardness, and the dragons did what they always did, which was to listen without hearing and hear without understanding and understand. Somehow, everything that mattered. He read for a long time. When the shift changed and the day cycle keepers arrived, there were 4 of them at the gallery entrance, and they stopped when they saw him, and they did not come in. He didn't look up. He kept reading. Tevar arrived at the gallery entrance at the 2nd hour of the day cycle. Tamaz heard him hard to miss. The Lord of Ceremonies had a presence that displaced air and kept reading. Storm's wings shifted against his side. Cole's grip tightened slightly, then released. "Maintenance staff," Tevar said in the formal register through Tamaz's translator bead. "Your farewell period has concluded." Tamaz turned a page. "The council has been patient," Tevar said. "The protocols have been honored. You have been permitted your farewell. Now you will leave this gallery and present yourself at the administrative block for reassignment processing." Blue shifted inside his jacket. "In a minute," Tamaz said. The silence from the gallery entrance had a texture to it. "You are not in a position," Tevar said, "to bargain. You are a human maintenance employee operating under a specific and limited diplomatic authorization. That authorization has now concluded. You will." Cole raised his head. Not a threat display, nothing so overt. Just raised his head and turned it toward the gallery entrance with the slow, deliberate attention of an animal that had heard something and was considering what to do about it. Copper unfolded from Tamaz's left side and stretched. Storm's wings moved, not opening, just shifting, a slight pressure change in the air of the gallery. Tevar stopped speaking. The silence held for a long moment. Tamaz set his book down, open, page down on the stone beside him. He looked at the gallery entrance for the first time. Tevar stood there with his frill fully fanned. Enormous, the size of a sail, the threat display of a 500-year-old court official who was not, Tamaz had gathered, accustomed to being contradicted. Behind Tevar, at some distance, Varithsky stood watching. Tamaz looked at her. She gave nothing back, just watched. He looked back at Tevar. He thought about the engineering degree that had never been relevant. He thought about the belt sander and the count and his father's voice. He thought about the photograph of his sister's kids at the beach. Then he picked up his book, closed it properly this time with his thumb marking the page, and stood up. Cole, Copper, Storm, and Blue moved with him the way water moves with a river. No drama, no resistance, just the reorganization of a collective in response to a change in the central thing's position. Cole on his left shoulder, Copper walking alongside his right leg, Storm above, circling lazy and tight in the gallery's upper air. Blue, as always, inside the jacket and therefore invisible to anyone who didn't know. He walked toward the gallery entrance. He did not slow down when Tevar didn't move. Tevar moved. Not quickly, not in the manner of retreat. He stepped aside, frills still fanned, head still high, maintaining every available signal of authority. But he moved, and Tamaz walked past him into the corridor. "The reassignment," Tevar said behind him. The formal register had an edge in it now. I'm not taking the reassignment, Tamaz said. He kept walking. You are in violation of the Accords. I'm in violation of the protocol your council applied, Tamaz said, still walking. The Accords say human service staff don't interfere with court traditions. I haven't interfered with anything. The Hatchlings came to me. I didn't go to them. The bond was made by them, not by me. That's Varethsky's word, not mine, and she knows more about Vrethkai tradition than either of us. He reached the corridor junction. He stopped, turned. The Accords also have a clause about diplomatic precedent. Section 12, subsection 4. The behavior of the royal clutch constitutes a form of diplomatic action under the treaty, because the clutch represents the succession of the Vrethkai ruling line. If I leave and the clutch registers distress, that's a diplomatic incident, not a maintenance issue. Your council authorized a reassignment without consulting the Section 12 clause. He had read the Accords 3 times during slow mop cycles. He had a lot of slow mop cycles. Tevar's frill went very still. Varethsky, behind him, made a sound that Tamaz's translator bead rendered as the Vrethkai equivalent of a very quiet exhale, the kind that you make when something has been resolved that you have been holding a long time. You knew this, Tevar said to Varethsky, not a question. I had reviewed the relevant clauses, she said. I did not consider it my place to interrupt a council session with what the human maintenance technician might independently discover. Tevar looked at Tamaz for a very long time. Cole had his chin resting on top of Tamaz's head. This was, objectively, undignified. Tamaz stood with it. What, Tevar said with great control, is it that you want? Tamaz thought about it. I want to keep my post, he said. I want to keep the long throat assignment. I want the twice-shift gallery access in my duty schedule, official this time, with a handler title if you need a title to put on the paperwork. I want a boiler room accommodation upgrade, just a cot with some insulation, nothing major. And I want the Hatchlings to have what they chose. He paused. I think that last one is what you actually care about when you strip everything else away. The bond, what it means for the succession. I'm not trying to be part of your succession. I'm just trying to not abandon 4 animals that came to me when they didn't have to. Tevar's frill was still. The corridor was silent except for the distant furnace pulse and Storm's lazy circles overhead. You are an engineer, Varethsky said. I am, he said. Mostly I mop floors. The Lord of Ceremonies looked at him for another long moment. Then the frill moved, not the threat display. Something else, something Tamaz had seen a few times in the past year and had still not fully mapped. He filed it as complicated. The council will need to reconvene, Tevar said. The clause will need to be reviewed by the treaty committee. This process will take time. I'll be here, Tamaz said. Obviously, Tevar said, and turned and walked stiffly back toward the administrative block. Varethsky watched him go. Then she looked at Tamaz with her one amber eye, and there was something in it that he thought, if he was reading it right across the full distance of species and 900 years, might have been satisfaction. Handle a raise, she said. Not official yet, he said. Precedent moves faster than paperwork, she said. It always has. She turned and followed Tevar at her own pace, which was very different from his, the pace of something that had watched a long time and had not today seen the thing it was watching go wrong. He stood in the corridor with coal on his head and copper at his feet and storm banking wide above him in the high air of the junction, and he thought, 11 months. 11 months of volcanic stone floors and sulfur and bioluminescent light, and the particular invisibility of being the maintenance technician in an alien royal court, the man with the mop and the broken paperback and the photograph in his pocket. He pulled out the book, found his page. Blue's nose appeared over the jacket's inner collar, and then retracted. Yeah, he said, I know. We'll get to it. He started back toward the long throat. There was still half a shift left. The floors didn't mop themselves. He walked, and Storm followed from above, and Copper walked the floor beside him in that loose, ungainly gait that hatchlings had before their wings took over as primary locomotion, and Cole rode his head with the imperial composure of an animal that had sorted out the world to its satisfaction. He walked the long throat with his mop, and his book and his dragons. He was not invisible anymore, but invisibility, it turned out, had never really been the point. The point was the floors. The point was the count to 7, the count to 11. The point was knowing when to stay still and when to walk forward, and the difference between those two things was not a matter of courage. Courage was the wrong word for it, too loud, too big. It was a matter of temperature, of warmth, of being the thing in the room that was, reliably, at the right temperature for the life that needed warmth. He reached the end of the long throat and turned back. Behind him, in the bioluminescent dark, the hatchlings followed. This was how it had always gone, and this was how it would keep going, and somewhere in the vast bureaucratic machinery of the Vrethkai treaty apparatus, someone was already pulling out the Section 12 clause and reading it for the first time, and Varethskai was already thinking about the paperwork for the handler redesignation, and Tevar was still walking, probably, stiff and dignified and wrong. Tamaz mopped the floor. He got to the part in the book about the brothers, the valley, the old argument between hardness and tenderness, and he read it aloud the way he always did, to no one in particular, to whatever was listening, to the warm dark of the corridor and the creatures that had come to him when he hadn't asked them to, and he thought, this is the work, all of it. The floors and the book and the mop and the count to 11, the warmth. He read until the end of the shift. He read until Cole, finally, fell asleep on his shoulder. Then he closed the book on his thumb, marked the page, and walked his dragons back to the hatching galleries, and handed them to the keeper on duty, a different one now, a young one, who received them with the careful reverence of someone handling irreplaceable things, and went to his boiler room, and lay down on the flat stone floor and slept. The citadel hummed around him. The furnaces ran their deep rhythm. 3 weeks later, the Treaty Committee published its finding on Section 12, Subsection 4. It ran to 14 pages of formal diplomatic language. Tamaz read it in 45 minutes in the break room adjacent to the long throat, standing because there was no chair that fit him in that room either, with his jacket on and a cup of the cook's warm thing in his hand. The finding confirmed what Varethskai had said. The behavior of the royal clutch constituted a diplomatically significant act. The existing handler redesignation protocols applied. The accords did not prohibit the appointment of a non-Vrethkai handler, because the accords had been written during a period when the concept of a non-Vrethkai handler had not been considered worth prohibiting. A gap in the language that the committee noted carefully and recommended be addressed in the next accords revision, which would take approximately 3 years to draft. In the meantime, pending revision, the existing handler protocols governed. Tamaz Reyes, human maintenance technician, grade 4, was eligible for redesignation as royal handler, a position that had not been filled in 40 years, which predated the current accords, and which therefore existed in a procedural space that the Treaty Committee described, with visible discomfort, as not explicitly governed by the current framework. He was, in other words, technically allowed, just not anticipated. He had written back to his sister that week. He wrote to her most months, less often than he should. The communication lag through the diplomatic relay was 3 days each way, and he had always been better at presents than correspondence. He told her he had gotten a job upgrade. He did not describe the specifics. She would ask about them later, and he would find a way to answer, and she would say the thing she always said, which was, "Tamaz, I don't know how you do it," and he would say the thing he always said, which was, "You just do the work." He sent the photograph of her kids to himself when he sent the letter, which was a thing he had recently started doing, not to replace the original, which was still in his breast pocket, but because the original was getting fragile. The corners had gone soft. The beach at Mazatlan was starting to blur at the edges, the way photographs did when they had been handled enough that the handling itself became part of the image. He kept it anyway. He kept it because it was the right size for a breast pocket, and because it reminded him, in the moments when the Citadel's otherness pressed in the 40-foot ceilings and the iron smell, and the light that was never quite right, that he was from a specific place on a specific rock in a specific solar system, and that on that rock there were small people who had stood in the shallows of an ocean and been happy, and that this was also the world, and he was also from it, and that mattered. He had explained the photograph once to the young gray-scaled keeper, whose name in translatable form was something like resonance at depth, which Tamaz had shortened to raise in his head and used nowhere else. Reyes had asked him, in the careful way of someone trying to understand a custom that did not map to anything familiar, why he carried an image of people he already knew. "So I don't forget," Tamaz had said. Reyes had considered this, forget them or forget you. He had thought about it, both, he'd said, neither, there's a thing in between. Reyes had processed this with the visible patience of a creature operating at a different cognitive timescale. "You are a strange mammal," Reyes had said, which from Reyes was about as warm as it got. The handler redesignation was formalized at the start of the next administrative cycle, in a brief ceremony in the North Wing receiving hall that Tamaz attended in his maintenance uniform, because he had not been informed there would be a ceremony, and had come directly from the long throat with the mop cart. Varethsky presented the formal token, a carved stone disc, dark as volcanic glass, warm in his hand, without visible commentary about the uniform. Tevar was present, as required by protocol. He watched the ceremony with his frill carefully neutral and said nothing, which Tamaz had come to understand was its own form of communication, and which in this context he read as, "I remain on record as opposed. I am also on record as complying. These are not the same thing, and I want that distinction preserved." He had nodded to Tevar when the ceremony finished. Tevar had held the neutral frill position for 2 more seconds and then, briefly, fractionally, dipped it, which the translator Bede did not interpret and which Tamaz, after 11 months and 3 weeks, understood to mean, "We are not the same kind of thing, you and I, and we will probably never agree. But you did not take more than you claimed, which is a thing I can work with." It was not friendship. It was something older than friendship, in a way, the acknowledgement between adversaries that each had operated according to their own coherent logic, and that neither logic had been entirely wrong. He had taken the stone disc back to the boiler room and set it on the small ledge above his flat stone floor, next to the photograph of the kids at Mazatlan. He looked at both of them for a while in the amber glow of the bioluminescent lantern the cook had left outside his door several weeks ago along with a food container, apparently as an escalating campaign to make his accommodations marginally less prehistoric. He had, as yet, not submitted the request for the insulated boiler room upgrade. He kept meaning to. He kept also thinking about the way Blue had pressed both forepaws flat against his chest from inside the jacket during the difficult passage of the book, counting his heartbeat. He kept thinking about how the boiler room was the warmest place in the lower corridors, and how the hatchlings had found him, the first time, by following the heat signature down through the ventilation architecture of the Citadel like a navigational calculation, like an equation with a clear answer at the end. He thought about whether an upgrade would change the thermal profile. He thought about whether it mattered. He thought it probably didn't. They'd find him regardless. They had found him once already in a place nobody thought to look. He filed the upgrade request. He wasn't unreasonable about it. What happened next, what happened over the months and eventually years that followed, was not the dramatic continuation of a single story. It was the accumulation of small things, the texture of a changed life laid down in layers the way stone was laid down, press by press, heat by heat, until you couldn't see the individual additions anymore and could only see what they had made. Cole grew. They all grew. The Vrethkai royal clutch developed in stages. The keepers tracked with careful record-keeping, but the rates were faster than the historical norm, which Varethkai attributed to factors she did not specify in the formal record, and which she told to Maz, in one of their corridor conversations, she thought had to do with the quality of bonding. A properly bonded clutch developed with different markers than an unbonded one. The data were old, 40 years since the last handler, but the pattern was clear in the historical records she had been reading, the ones pressed into stone in the old cursive that the translator couldn't parse. She had been learning the old script herself, she told him. She had been reading things that had not been read in a long time. "What do they say?" he had asked. "That handlers were not always Vrethkai," she said. "That in the oldest periods, the time before the court formalized, the hatchlings were the ones who decided, not the keepers, not the dynasty." She had paused. That the bond recognized warmth of a specific kind, which the old texts described not as physical heat but as a thing that burns without consuming. A fire that does not reduce what it touches. She had looked at him with her one amber eye for a moment. "I had assumed this was metaphor. Now I am less certain." He had thought about that. He thought about it during mop cycles, the way he thought about things, not systematically, not efficiently, just letting it turn over in the back of his mind while the work happened in the front of it. A fire that does not reduce what it touches. He thought about the photograph, still in his pocket, the edges going soft. He thought about the belt sander and his father's voice, and the count that had become a reflex. He thought about his engineering degree and the floors and the broken Steinbeck spine, and the names he had given 4 dragons in the privacy of his own head. He thought about what it meant to be in a place where you were not designed to be, where nothing was built for you, where you were 3 sizes smaller than the furniture and could not read the inscriptions on the walls, and to stay anyway, not because leaving was impossible but because the staying had become, without announcement, a thing you were doing on purpose. He didn't have a word for it either. He had the count, the photograph, the book, the mop. He had the disc of volcanic glass on the ledge and the warm thing the cook left outside the door. He had 4 names that belonged entirely to him and that he would carry until he didn't need them anymore. He had the specific warmth of Cole's side against his palm in the gallery at the quiet hour, and the way blue appeared inside his jacket with the stubborn regularity of a phenomenon that had decided not to need explanation, and the way Storm sometimes descended from the high air with her full wingspan extended, all 12 feet of it now, and banked a slow circle just above his head in the long throat with the deliberate beauty of something that wanted to be seen. And the way Copper walked beside his right leg on the gallery floor with the same loose gait she had always had, not because she needed to, her wings were strong now, she was fast in the air, but because she chose to. They chose things. That was the part he came back to in the end, the part that meant something beyond biology or body heat or the thermodynamics of an alien palace. They were not domesticated. They were not trained. They were the royal clutch of the Vrethkai, ancient and fireborn, and carrying in their genetics the weight of a succession that was thousands of years old. They had come to him out of the ventilation channels and the secondary corridors and the gallery darkness, and they had made a choice, and the choice was him. Not because of what he knew or what he could offer or what his formal designation entitled him to. Because of what he was on a Tuesday at 3 in the morning in a corridor nobody was watching, with his mop and his broken book and his photograph and his count to 11. He was enough. That was the choice. That was what they had said, landing on him without warning in a secondary corridor of a building not built for him, pressing themselves against the warmth of his chest and going still. He was, specifically and sufficiently, enough. He read until the end of the shift. He read until Cole, asleep against his side, made the contented sound so deep it was more vibration than sound, more warmth than noise. a low resonance that moved through the stone of the handler's platform and into the floor of the gallery, and probably, if you had the right instruments, all the way down through the volcanic rock to whatever furnace had made this mountain and was still, somewhere in the deep dark below them, burning. A fire that does not reduce what it touches. He thought, yes, that was about right. He closed the book on his thumb, marked the page, and walked his dragons back to the hatching galleries one more time, and handed them off, and went to the boiler room and lay down and slept. The citadel hummed around him. The furnaces ran their deep rhythm. And in the hatching galleries, 4 young dragons who had found in an alien royal court the specific warmth they had been looking for, the warmth of something that asked nothing, offered everything, and stayed, slept too, in the heat of their stone, and dreamed of whatever it is that young dragons dream of. Probably warmth. Probably that.